Good morning, darling. Are you coming up for some breakfast?
Before I understood economics, ownership, or why businesses mattered, I understood Miss Smith. I lived in apartment 807 in Cabrini-Green. Miss Smith lived in apartment 803. She was already elderly when I knew her. As a child, I noticed the wrinkles in her face and the way she moved carefully when she walked. The elevators in our building did not always work, and climbing 8 flights of stairs was difficult for many older residents. But Miss Smith and I had become friends. Sometimes I would be downstairs in the courtyard with my folding grocery cart, getting ready to walk to the store. Then I would hear someone calling my name. When I looked up, there she was, 8 floors above me, leaning from her apartment window, waving her hand. I would wave back. Then something remarkable would happen. Miss Smith would tie money and a grocery list inside a handkerchief and carefully drop it from her window. I would watch it float through the air like a little white parachute. When it reached the ground, I would pick it up and open it carefully. Inside would be her grocery list and the money she trusted me to spend for her. Back then, I thought I was just helping a neighbor. I did not realize I was witnessing something larger. Because in Cabrini-Green, people looked after one another. Children helped elders. Neighbors helped neighbors. And communities survived because ordinary people carried responsibilities for one another every single day. So I would grab my folding grocery cart, check Miss Smith's list, and start walking toward Pioneer Market or Dale's Market. At the time, those stores felt like they would always be there. I had no way of knowing that one day they would disappear. Back then, Pioneer Market and Dale's Market were simply part of life. They were where mothers stretched a week's worth of money into meals. They were where children carried grocery lists folded inside their pockets. They were where neighbors exchanged news while standing in checkout lines. To me, they were simply the places I walked to with Miss Smith's grocery list and my folding cart. I never thought about who owned them. I never thought about economics. I never thought about supply chains, investments, or community development. I was just a little girl trying to remember everything on the list before I got to the store. Milk, bread, sugar, coffee. Sometimes canned goods. Sometimes things I couldn't pronounce. But Miss Smith always trusted me to get it right. And I took that responsibility seriously, because when someone trusts a child, that child often tries their hardest not to let them down. The walk itself felt normal. The stores were busy. People came and went. Cash registers rang. Shopping carts rolled across the floor. The shelves were stocked. Food was available. Looking back now, I realized that what felt ordinary was actually something precious. A neighborhood that could feed itself. A community with businesses close enough for families to reach on foot. Stores that served thousands of residents living in the surrounding buildings. Most people never think about those things while they still exist. When I think about Cabrini-Green in the 1960s, I remember the sound of grocery carts rattling over cracked pavement, the smell of fresh bread from Pioneer Market, and the laughter echoing up 8 flights of stairs. Apartment 807 was home, but Miss Smith in 803 was family. Every Saturday, clutching her handwritten list, I'd make the trip to Dale's Market. It wasn't just about groceries. It was about trust. Miss Smith would press $1 into my palm, her eyes full of hope that I'd return with bread, eggs, and a story. The elevator was often broken, so I'd drag those bags up every step, neighbors cheering me on, sometimes lending a hand. Our markets weren't just stores, they were lifelines, keeping resources in our hands. After the riots, when Pioneer and Dales boarded up for good, everything changed. No more carts, no more shared meals, no more helping hands. We lost more than food, we lost independence. With businesses gone, outsiders controlled what and if we ate. Building and supporting our own businesses wasn't just survival, it was power, dignity, and the heartbeat of our community. When the stores disappeared, so did a piece of us. When I think about Cabrini-Green in the 1960s, I remember the sound of grocery carts rattling over cracked pavement, the smell of fresh bread from Pioneer Market, and the laughter echoing up 8 flights of stairs. Apartment 807 was home, but Miss Smith in 803 was family. Every Saturday, clutching her handwritten list, I'd make the trip to Dale's Market. It wasn't just about groceries, it was about trust. Miss Smith would press $1 into my palm, her eyes full of hope that I'd return with bread, eggs, and a story. The elevator was often broken, so I'd drag those bags up every step, neighbors cheering me on, sometimes lending a hand. Our markets weren't just stores, they were lifelines, keeping resources in our hands. After the riots, when Pioneer and Dales boarded up for good, everything changed. No more carts, no more shared meals, no more helping hands. We lost more than food, we lost independence. With businesses gone, outsiders controlled what and if we ate. Building and supporting our own businesses wasn't just survival, it was power, dignity, and the heartbeat of our community. When the stores disappeared, so did a piece of us. Some families, putting food on the table became more difficult than it had been before. I remember hearing adults talk about it. Not in speeches, not in political discussions, just ordinary conversations between people trying to figure out how they were going to get through another week. Some families had relatives with cars, some didn't. Some people could travel across the city for groceries, some couldn't. And for elderly residents like Miss Smith, every extra mile might as well have been 10. The loss of those stores exposed something many of us had never thought about before: dependence. A community can depend upon businesses for decades, but if the community does not control enough of those businesses, it may not control what happens when they leave. As a child, I wasn't thinking about ownership. I was thinking about groceries. I was thinking about helping Miss Smith. I was thinking about carrying bags up 8 flights of stairs when the elevators weren't working. But looking back now, I can see lessons that were invisible to me then. The people who came out of slavery had understood something important. That is why so many black communities encouraged business ownership. Barbershops, beauty shops, restaurants, insurance companies, funeral homes, grocery stores. Not because business owners were rich, but because ownership created stability. Ownership gave a community a voice in its own future. The moment someone else controls everything you need, they also control what happens when they decide to leave. And in many neighborhoods across America, that lesson would be learned over and over again. Stores closed, jobs disappeared, resources moved elsewhere. Meanwhile, the people who remained were left trying to figure out how to rebuild with fewer tools than they had before. I didn't understand it then. I only knew that something was missing. Something larger than a grocery store. something larger than a building. What was disappearing was a piece of the community's ability to take care of itself. Years later, I began to understand why older generations spoke so often about supporting local businesses. When I was young, I thought they were simply talking about making money, but they were talking about survival. Because every dollar spent in a neighborhood could either strengthen that neighborhood or slowly leave it. The elders understood that businesses did more than sell products. They hired people, they trained people, they sponsored little league teams, they donated to churches, they extended credit when times were hard. Sometimes they knew families by name. Sometimes they knew which child belonged to which parent. Sometimes they quietly helped people through difficult seasons without ever asking for recognition. That was especially true in many Black communities where relationships often mattered as much as the transaction itself. People were not simply customers. They were neighbors, and neighbors looked after one another. That is one reason so many community leaders encouraged people to support businesses that invested back into the community. Not because every business owner was perfect, not because every business was Black owned, but because communities survive when resources circulate rather than disappear. The lesson sounds simple, yet generation after generation fought to preserve it. Spend wisely, support each other, build something that can outlive you. Because if a community does not participate in creating its own economic future, someone else will eventually decide that future for them. And history has shown us many times what can happen when that occurs. But I wasn't thinking about any of those lessons when I was standing beneath Miss Smith's window. I was still just a little girl with a folding grocery cart. I wasn't studying economics. I wasn't studying business ownership. I wasn't studying community development. I was studying responsibility. Because every time Miss Smith trusted me with her grocery list, she was teaching me something without either of us realizing it. She was teaching me that communities survive when people care about one another. She was teaching me that independence does not always mean doing everything yourself. Sometimes independence means knowing you can depend on trustworthy people around you. That handkerchief she lowered from 8 floors above carried more than money. It carried trust. And trust is one of the most valuable forms of wealth any community can possess. Looking back now, I can still see that white handkerchief floating through the air. I can still see myself catching it. I can still remember opening it carefully and checking the list before heading toward Pioneer Market or Dale's Market. At the time, I wasn't thinking about history. I wasn't thinking about economics. I wasn't thinking about ownership. I was thinking about whether I could remember everything Miss Smith needed before I got to the store. And like many children, I wanted to do the job right. I didn't want to come back missing an item. I didn't want to disappoint her. So I would look at that list over and over again as I walked. Those trips probably seemed small to everyone else, but when I look back now, I realized they were teaching me lessons that would stay with me for the rest of my life. Responsibility, reliability, service, the importance of helping people who needed help. Those values were not taught only in classrooms. They were taught in neighborhoods. They were taught in churches. They were taught in apartment hallways. They were taught by grandparents, parents, neighbors, and elders who understood that communities survive when people look after one another. In many ways, Miss Smith was one of my teachers. Not because she stood in front of a classroom, but because she trusted me. And sometimes trust can teach lessons no textbook ever could. Years later, when I became a teacher and later a nurse, I often thought about the people who had quietly shaped my life. People who may never have realized the influence they had. People who simply lived their values every day. Miss Smith was one of those people. Smith was one. She never gave me a lecture about community. She never stood in front of a classroom and explained economic development. She never talked about ownership, investments, or keeping dollars circulating in the neighborhood. Yet somehow, she taught me all of those things, not with words, with trust. And maybe that is one of the reasons so many important lessons survive across generations. Because the lessons people remember most are often the ones they live, not the ones they hear. Looking back now, I realize that many of the people who shaped my life were not famous. They were not elected officials. They were not wealthy business owners. They were ordinary people carrying extraordinary responsibilities. People like Miss Smith, people like my mother, people like the neighbors who watched over children that were not their own. People who understood that survival required cooperation long before anyone used words like community development. In Cabrini-Green, people often shared more than space. They shared information. They shared transportation. They shared child care. They shared food. And sometimes they shared hope. Because there were days when hope itself felt like a resource that needed to be passed from one person to another. The older I become, the more I understand that communities are built through thousands of small acts that rarely make headlines. A ride to the grocery store, a meal shared with a neighbor, a child trusted with responsibility, a helping hand when someone can no longer do something alone. Those moments may seem small, but enough small acts performed over many years can hold an entire community together. And perhaps that is why the disappearance of businesses hurts so deeply. Because when a neighborhood loses stores, it often loses more than products. It loses gathering places. It loses relationships. It loses routines. It loses some of the invisible connections that help neighbors remain neighbors. And once those connections begin to disappear, rebuilding them is often much harder than anyone expects. What happened after the riots taught many of us that lesson. The liquor stores eventually came back. The grocery stores did not. As a child, I didn't fully understand why. I only knew that finding food had become more difficult. The places where families bought bread, milk, vegetables, and everyday necessities were no longer there the way they had once been. And when food becomes harder to find, people begin finding other ways to survive. Some of the individuals who participated in the looting ended up with large quantities of groceries. For families that had not been involved, a strange new reality emerged. People began selling food to neighbors. Food that had once been sitting on grocery store shelves was now being sold person to person. Looking back, it sounds unbelievable. But when communities are under pressure, people adapt. They do what they think they must do to survive. Some families had food. Some families did not. Some people had transportation. Some people did not. And in the middle of all of it were ordinary residents simply trying to make it through another week. I remember watching these changes happen around me without fully understanding what they meant. I was still young, still learning, still carrying grocery bags and listening to adults talk. But even then, I could sense that something fundamental had changed. The neighborhood I knew before the riots was not the same neighborhood afterward. And once a community loses access to the things it depends upon, getting them back is often much harder than losing them in the first place. What stayed with me most was not the fire, it was the aftermath. The long period afterward when people were trying to figure out how to live without the things they once relied upon. History books often focus on the dramatic moments, the marches, the speeches, the riots, the headlines, but ordinary people usually live inside the consequences. And consequences can last much longer than a single event. For months and years afterward, families still needed groceries. Children still needed to eat. Elderly residents still needed help. Life did not pause simply because a crisis had occurred. In many ways, that was the lesson my neighborhood was teaching me. Communities do not survive because difficult things never happen. Communities survive because people find ways to continue after difficult things happen. That is what I saw in Cabrini-Green. I saw mothers adapting. I saw grandparents adapting. I saw neighbors adapting. I saw people helping one another, even when resources were limited. Looking back now, I think that resilience deserves to be remembered, because it is easy to tell stories about destruction. It is harder to tell stories about survival. Yet survival is often where the most important lessons are found. The people around me were teaching those lessons every day. Not through speeches, not through books, but through the choices they made when circumstances became difficult. And perhaps that is where the deeper meaning of Commandment number 6 begins to emerge. Because ownership was never only about money. Ownership was about having enough control over your future that a single crisis could not completely determine what happened next. The generations that came before us understood that lesson well. Many of them had lived through things far more difficult than I could imagine as a child. They had survived segregation, migration, discrimination, poverty, broken promises. And because they had survived those things, they often looked at businesses differently. A grocery store was not just a grocery store. A barber shop was not just a barber shop. A beauty shop was not just a beauty shop. Those places represented stability, opportunity, employment, a chance to build something that could serve the community for years to come. Perhaps that is why so many elders encouraged younger generations to think beyond a paycheck, to think about ownership, to think about building, to think about leaving something behind for the people who would come after them. I did not understand those conversations when I was young. Most children don't. Children usually assume the world around them will remain exactly as it is. The stores will always be there. The adults will always be there. But life eventually teaches us otherwise. Things change. Neighborhoods change. Businesses change. People move away. Buildings disappear. And sometimes entire ways of life can vanish within a single generation. That is why memory matters. Because memory helps us understand what was lost. And understanding what was lost can help us understand what is worth rebuilding. The neighborhood I knew before the riots was not the same neighborhood afterward. And once a community loses access to the things it depends upon, getting them back is often much harder than losing them in the first place. As a child, I did not have the words to describe what I was witnessing. I only knew that something important had changed. The rhythm of the neighborhood felt different. The routines felt different. The sense of certainty felt different. Before, there had been places people counted on, places people assumed would always be there. Then suddenly, many of those assumptions disappeared. That experience stayed with me for years, long after I left Cabrini-Green, long after I became a mother, long after I became a teacher and later a nurse. Because eventually I began to understand that what happened in my neighborhood was not unique. Versions of the same story had unfolded in communities all across America. A business closes, a resource disappears, a service moves somewhere else, and the people left behind must figure out how to adapt. Sometimes they succeed. Sometimes they struggle. Most often they do a little of both. That is why the elders spoke so often about building schools, building churches, building businesses, building organizations, building institutions that could survive difficult times. Because they understood something many of us learn only later. Freedom is easier to keep when a community possesses some control over the resources it depends upon. And perhaps that was the lesson hidden inside all those grocery trips for Miss Smith. Before we continue, I'd love to hear from you. Did you have a neighbor like Miss Smith growing up? Someone who watched over you, trusted you, or became part of your family even though they weren't related? Tell me about them in the comments. And if these stories matter to you, consider subscribing so together we can preserve memories that history books often leave behind. I thought I was carrying groceries, but I was also carrying a lesson I would not fully understand until many years later. As a child, I believed the stores would always be there, just as I believed the adults around me would always be there. That was the nature of childhood. The world feels permanent when you are young. You assume tomorrow will look very much like today, but life has a way of teaching otherwise. The stores disappeared, neighbors moved away, buildings changed, entire communities transformed, and slowly I began to understand why so many older people spoke about ownership with such seriousness. They were not talking only about money. They were talking about protection. Protection against uncertainty, protection against instability, protection against having your future determined entirely by decisions made somewhere else. The people who came before us had seen what happened when communities possessed too little control over the resources they depended upon. Many had lived through segregation. Many had lived through discrimination. Many had watched opportunities appear and disappear with little warning. Because of that, they often placed great importance on building things that could survive difficult times. A business, a church, a school, a family home. Something rooted deeply enough to remain standing when circumstances changed. Looking back now, I think that was one of the hidden goals behind so much of what earlier generations tried to teach. Not simply survival for one day, but stability for many years. Not simply earning a living, but creating something that could continue serving the community long after they were gone. And perhaps that is why the disappearance of Pioneer Market and Dale's Market stayed with me for so many years. Because without realizing it, I had witnessed how quickly something important could vanish when a community depended upon resources it did not fully control. As I grew older, I began noticing that many of the conversations older Black Americans had about business were connected to experiences like these. Some had lived through times when they could not shop wherever they wanted. Some had lived through times when they could not work wherever they wanted. Some had lived through times when opportunity itself seemed restricted by invisible barriers. Because of that, many believed communities should build as much as they possibly could for themselves, not to separate from the rest of society, but to strengthen themselves within it. A grocery store, a pharmacy, a restaurant, a construction company, a newspaper, a bank. Every business represented more than a source of income. It represented options, and options matter, because people with options can adapt more easily when circumstances change. People without options often find themselves waiting for someone else to solve problems they did not create. Looking back now, I think that may have been one of the hidden fears many elders carried. Not fear of hard work. They knew how to work. Not fear of sacrifice. They understood sacrifice well. The fear was dependence. Fear was watching communities become vulnerable because too many important decisions were being made somewhere else. Somewhere beyond the neighborhood. Somewhere beyond the people most affected by those decisions. And history had already given plenty of examples of what could happen when communities lost control over the things they depended upon. Jobs could disappear. Businesses could relocate. Investments could dry up. Promises could be broken. Meanwhile, the people left behind still had to find ways to live, still had to raise children, still had to care for elders, still had to build a future with whatever remained. Perhaps that is why so many elders spoke with such determination. When they talked about ownership, they were not speaking from theory. They were speaking from experience. Many of them had watched opportunities come and go. Many had watched neighborhoods rise and struggle. Many had learned that waiting for someone else to solve your problems was a dangerous strategy. So they taught what they knew. Save what you can. Learn what you can. Build what you can. Support what serves the community. Protect what has taken generations to create. Those lessons appeared in different forms throughout Black history. Sometimes they were spoken from church pulpits, sometimes around kitchen tables, sometimes from storefronts, sometimes from grandparents sitting quietly on front porches. But the message was often remarkably similar. Try to leave something stronger behind than what you inherited. When I think about commandment number 6 now, I realize it is not really a commandment about money. Money is only the tool. The deeper lesson is responsibility. Responsibility to family, responsibility to neighbors, responsibility to future generations. Because every generation inherits something, and every generation leaves something behind. The question is whether what we leave behind makes the next generation stronger or more dependent than we were. That question was present in Cabrini-Green long before I understood it. It was present every time Miss Smith trusted me with that grocery list. and it was present every time a neighborhood struggled to hold on to something worth keeping. Looking back now, I realize that many of the adults around me were carrying burdens I could not see as a child. They worried about rent. They worried about food. They worried about safety. They worried about whether their children would have opportunities they themselves had never been given. Yet despite those worries, they kept building. They kept working. They kept investing their time, energy, and hope into the people around them. That is one of the things I remember most about the generation that raised me. They were builders. Some built families. Some built churches. Some built businesses. Some built careers. Some built opportunities for children who were not even their own. Many of them understood that lasting change rarely happens overnight. It happens one decision at a time, one sacrifice at a time, one generation at a time. Perhaps that is why so many elders believed ownership mattered. Ownership created roots. Roots helped people stay connected, and connected people are often more capable of helping one another during difficult times. That does not mean ownership solves every problem. It doesn't. But ownership can provide a measure of stability in a world where many things remain uncertain. The people who came before us understood that. They understood that communities need more than hope. They need institutions. They need relationships. They need opportunities. And they need people willing to invest in something larger than themselves. Maybe that is what Miss Smith was teaching me all along, without ever saying a word. Maybe every grocery list carried a lesson about trust, a lesson about service, and a lesson about what communities must do if they hope to endure. Because endurance is not an accident. Strong communities rarely appear by chance. They are built, maintained, protected, and sometimes rebuilt after tremendous loss. The older I become, the more I appreciate the people who chose to build even when the future was uncertain. People who opened businesses when success was not guaranteed. People who invested in neighborhoods others had given up on. People who stayed when leaving might have been easier. People who believed their communities were worth fighting for. Those are the people who help create opportunities for generations they would never meet. And perhaps that is one of the greatest forms of faith a person can have. To plant something knowing someone else may enjoy the harvest. To build something knowing someone else may benefit from it. To sacrifice today so that tomorrow can be better. That idea appears again and again throughout Black history. Parents sacrificing for children. Grandparents sacrificing for grandchildren. Business owners sacrificing for communities. Teachers sacrificing for students. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things because they believed the future was worth investing in. And when I think back to Cabrini-Green, I realize I was surrounded by people like that every day. I just didn't recognize it at the time. Children rarely see the full weight adults carry. We see the results. We see the meals placed on the table. We see the rent somehow getting paid. We see the lights come on when a switch is flipped. We see groceries appear in cabinets and refrigerators. What we often do not see are the sacrifices that made those things possible. The second jobs, the long hours, the worries kept hidden from children, the difficult choices adults make when resources are limited. Looking back now, I understand that many of the adults around me were performing acts of quiet courage every single day. They were building lives in circumstances that were often far from easy. Yet somehow they continued moving forward. That determination became one of the greatest lessons my generation inherited. Not perfection, not wealth, not certainty. Determination. The determination to keep going. The determination to keep building. The determination to keep believing. The determination to keep believing that tomorrow could be better than today. That may sound simple, but history shows us that it is one of the most powerful decisions a person can make. Because there are always reasons to give up, always reasons to become discouraged, always reasons to believe that nothing will ever change. Yet, generation after generation chose to believe otherwise. They chose to keep building. They chose to keep teaching. They chose to keep saving. They chose to keep investing in their families, their churches, their neighborhoods, and their children, even when progress was slow, even when setbacks occurred, even when the future seemed uncertain. Looking back now, I think that is one reason the stories of ordinary people matter so much. History often celebrates famous leaders, and those leaders deserve to be remembered. But communities are usually sustained by people whose names never appear in books. The mother working 2 jobs, the grandfather fixing things around the neighborhood, the teacher staying late to help a struggling student, the pastor opening church doors when families need support, the neighbor checking on an elderly resident who lives alone. People like Miss Smith, people like my mother, people whose contributions may seem small when viewed individually, but together create the foundation upon which communities stand. And perhaps that is what Commandment number 6 is really asking us to remember. Not simply who owned the businesses, but why people work so hard to build them in the first place. Because businesses were often part of something larger. They were part of a vision that communities could become stronger, more stable, more independent, more capable of shaping their own future. The stores I remember as a child were not merely places to shop. They were signs that people had invested their labor, their savings, and their hopes into something they believed would serve the community. And when those stores disappeared, the loss reminded everyone of a difficult truth. Things that take years to build can sometimes disappear much faster than anyone expects. Perhaps that is why so many elders worried about what would happen to the next generation. Not because they doubted us, but because they understood how fragile progress can be. They had seen gains made and gains lost, opportunities created and opportunities taken away, businesses opened and businesses closed. Yet they continued teaching the same lessons. Build, save, learn, support one another, create something that can outlive you. When I think about Miss Smith now, I realize she probably never imagined that decades later I would still be talking about those grocery trips. Yet here I am, still remembering, still learning from them, still discovering lessons that were hidden inside ordinary moments. A handkerchief, a grocery list, a folding cart, a walk to the store. At the time, those things seemed small. Today, they feel like pieces of a larger story. A story about community. A story about responsibility. And a story about what happens when people decide they are willing to build something together. Maybe that is the real legacy of Commandment number 6. Not simply ownership, but stewardship. The understanding that what we inherit is not ours alone. It is something we are temporarily responsible for before passing it on to those who come after us. After the riots, nobody was talking about rebuilding. The grocery stores had been looted. I don't blame the owners for being afraid. They never came back. The city buses stopped coming too. The streets had been torn up by tanks rolling through the neighborhood, and for years it seemed like nobody was in a hurry to fix them. As a child, I learned to walk around the damage. Burned buildings became part of the landscape. Empty lots became part of the landscape. Skeletons of businesses stood where grocery stores once fed families. At first I thought things would return to normal. Then months passed. Then years. And eventually I stopped expecting anything to come back. I simply learned new routes to get where I needed to go. Longer walks. Different buses. Different neighborhoods. Life moved forward, even when the neighborhood seemed frozen in place. By the time I graduated from high school, got married, and became a mother, much of that damage was still part of the story people lived with every day. My husband and I eventually moved to the north side of Chicago into a Puerto Rican neighborhood that welcomed us. But I never forgot what it felt like to watch an entire community lose businesses, transportation, and opportunities, and then wait for help that never seemed to arrive. As a child, I thought the lesson was about grocery stores. As an adult, I realized it was about ownership. The people in Cabrini-Green did not decide whether Pioneer Market stayed. We did not decide whether Dale's Market reopened. We did not decide whether the buses returned. We did not decide whether the streets were repaired. Those decisions belonged to people who often lived somewhere else, people who could leave, and many of them did. For years I carried that memory without fully understanding what it meant. Then one day I realized something. Ownership is not just about making money. Ownership is about having a voice in what happens next. Ownership is about having the power to invest, the power to rebuild, the power to stay, the power to leave something behind for the next generation. That may be one of the reasons so many Black leaders after emancipation encouraged people to build businesses, buy land, and support one another economically. They understood that freedom without economic stability could disappear quickly. But there is another lesson I learned as I grew older. Ownership alone is not enough, because ownership asks what belongs to me. Stewardship asks what I am responsible for. The people who helped build strong communities understood the difference. They were not simply trying to accumulate things. They were trying to leave something behind. A business, a church, a school, a home, a tradition, an opportunity their children might inherit. Perhaps that is the real question every generation must answer, not what did we own, but what did we leave behind? What did we build that continued serving people after we were gone? Because grocery stores can disappear, buildings can burn, neighborhoods can change, but the lessons we leave behind can survive long after the storefronts are gone. When I think about Miss Smith now, I realize she was part of something larger than I understood as a child. She was part of a generation that believed neighbors mattered, a generation that knew survival was rarely an individual accomplishment. People made it because somebody checked on them, Somebody shared food. Somebody watched the children. Somebody carried the groceries. Somebody opened a door when times became difficult. Those acts may have seemed small at the time, but communities are often held together by small acts repeated over and over again. And perhaps that is what I remember most. Not the grocery lists, not the folding carts, not even the stores themselves. What I remember is the responsibility people felt toward one another. Long before anyone used words like community development or economic empowerment, ordinary people were already practicing them. They understood that a neighborhood could not survive if everyone looked out only for themselves. Someone had to think about the future. Someone had to think about the elders. Someone had to think about the children who would inherit whatever was left behind. That may be the deepest lesson I carried away from Cabrini-Green. The strongest communities are not built by people asking, "What can I get?" They are built by people asking, "What can I contribute?" They are built by people who understand that every generation inherits both opportunities and responsibilities. The generation before me left lessons. Some left businesses, some left churches, some left homes, some left stories, and some left warnings. Warnings about what can happen when people lose control over the institutions that shape their daily lives. Because the lesson of ownership was never only about stores, it was never only about land, it was never only about money, it was about power. The power to make decisions, the power to influence the future, the power to determine what happens in your own community. And once I began to understand that, I started seeing history differently. I began to realize that many of the struggles Black Americans faced after emancipation were not simply battles for survival. They were battles for representation, battles for access, battles for the right to participate in decisions that affected their families, their neighborhoods, and their futures. Who decides where resources go? Who decides which communities receive investment? Who decides which voices are heard? Who decides whose concerns matter? Those questions did not disappear when slavery ended. In many ways, they became the next great struggle, because freedom required more than earning a living. Freedom required having a voice. And throughout American history, generations of Black citizens discovered that protecting that voice required knowledge, organization, persistence, and courage. The struggle was no longer simply about building businesses. It was also about understanding the laws, understanding the courts, understanding the ballot box, understanding how power worked. Because if ownership helped protect a community's economic future, then civic participation helped protect its political future. And that brings us to the next commandment, a lesson generations fought hard to learn, a lesson that remains just as important today. Study the law. Study the law. Claim your rights. And never surrender your voice. Because looking back now, I realize commandment number 6 was never really about grocery stores. It was about people. People like Miss Smith. People who depended on neighbors. People who built communities one relationship at a time. People who understood that survival was not an individual project. It was a collective responsibility. I never saw Miss Smith again. Life moved on. I graduated, got married, became a mother, moved to another neighborhood. But somehow, after all these years, I still remember carrying those grocery lists down 8 flights of stairs. And perhaps that is the lesson. The businesses may be gone. The buildings may be gone. The neighborhood itself may have changed. But the values that held a community together do not have to disappear. Responsibility, stewardship, service, the belief that what happens to your neighbor matters to you. Those are things worth preserving. Those are things worth passing on. And those are the things every generation must survive. The struggle was no longer simply about building businesses. It was also about understanding the laws, understanding the courts, understanding the ballot box, understanding how power worked. Because if ownership helped protect a community's economic future, then civic participation helped protect its political future. And that brings us to the next commandment. A lesson generations fought hard to learn. A lesson that remains just as important today. Study the law. Study the law. Claim your rights. And never surrender your voice. Because looking back now, I realize commandment number 6 was never really about grocery stores. It was about people. People like Miss Smith. People who depended on neighbors. People who built communities one relationship at a time. People who understood that survival was not an individual project. It was a collective responsibility. I never saw Miss Smith again. Life moved on. I graduated, got married, became a mother, moved to another neighborhood. But somehow, after all these years, I still remember carrying those grocery lists down 8 flights of stairs. And perhaps that is the lesson. The businesses may be gone. The buildings may be gone. The neighborhood itself may have changed. But the values that held a community together do not have to disappear. Responsibility, stewardship, service, the belief that what happens to your neighbor matters to you. Those are things worth preserving. Those are things worth passing on. And those are the things every generation must survive. Because the next challenge was already coming. And to meet it, people would need more than businesses. They would need to understand the law. They would need to understand their rights. And they would need the courage to defend both. That story begins with commandment number 7. Those are things worth preserving. Those are things worth passing on. And those are the things every generation must protect if freedom is going to survive. Next time, commandment number 7, study the law, claim your rights.